Reclusive mountain man adopted 3 homeless kids. Unaware they were heirs to 6 million. Snow gnawed at Elias Thornton's boots as he moved through Pine Hollow, Colorado on a January night in a wind scraped the false fronts of shuttered buildings, and the single lantern by Amos's store shook like a tired heart. 60, scarred by war, Elias wanted flour, salt, and a quiet walk home. Nothing that required names or promises. A clink behind the store cut the wind. He found 3 children at the barrels. Lila, 10, standing like a small sentinel. Tobin, 8, fingers numb but careful. Mira, 6, wrapped in a scarf too thin for the frost. Their coats were ragged, their eyes steady. Lila's hand hit a photograph he only glimpsed. A couple smiling beside a locomotive number he could not forget. Warmth first, Elias said. Talk later. Inside the stove's iron belly thumped. He bought bread, beans, and tea, and watched the way Lila counted exits. How Tobin studied every nail in the floor. How Mira traced a threadbare seam as if guarding a secret. When Lila lifted her cup, he saw an inked mark on her wrist, neat as a ledger clerk's stamp. Railroad, ownership, debt. Bootprints crossed fresh snow beyond the window. 2 men, long stride, turning back toward town. Not drifters, seekers. Just one night at my cabin, Elias said, hearing his own rule break. I'll see you safe to morning. Lila weighed the offer. She nodded but kept the photograph close as if the paper itself could burn. Elias told himself it was mercy for a single storm, yet the locomotive number clawed at memory, tied to money, courts, and men who did not forget. What he didn't know, the children carried a $6 million truth along those rails, and someone had already sold the map to his door. Before dawn a whistle cut the dark, counting down choice. Snow had been falling for 3 days when Elias Thornton returned to the pine log cabin that had become the boundary of his life. The house crouched beneath firs, its roof bent under a patient weight of white, and a thin ribbon of smoke trailed from the chimney into a broad gray sky. Inside, simple rituals governed him. Fetch water at dawn, bank the stove before dusk, mend what had frayed. Each task repaid itself with warmth and a certainty that no argument could overturn. Elias kept very little that belonged to the world of towns. A rifle rested near the east window, an oil lamp hung from a hook above a scuffed table, a tin of salt lay beside cups that many hands had smoothed. Long ago the war taught him how quickly a life could unravel, and solitude offered a steady sameness that he found tolerable. Work refused promises, but it returned something truer. A quiet ledger of effort and result. The 3 came to his path late in the afternoon, carrying the tired patience of those who have learned small economies. Lila led with an alert calm, 10 years old but moving with the surety of someone who guarded others. Tobin, 8, scanned edges and hollows as if everything could be read. He turned every fallen bark and listened for the shift of small animals beneath snow. Little Mira, 6, walked with a trust that felt taught rather than natural. She took Elias's offered glove without long inspection and let herself be guided across ice that could break a careless leg. The trek from Pine Hollow took 3 hours instead of the usual 2 because the wind shifted and visibility thinned. Lila chose routes that sheltered them from open gullies and kept to trees that cut the wind. She checked Tobin's laces a dozen times and tugged Mira's scarf up over her ears until the child scowled and then smiled as if obeying an old familiar command. When the trail narrowed, Lila drew a small folded photograph from within her dress and thumbed its edge, as if the paper held more than just an image. Elias saw a man and a woman smiling beside a locomotive, and at the corner the suggestion of a number stamped into steel. Inside the cabin he banked the coals and coaxed a pot to boil. The stove responded with a domestic chorus. Elias measured cornmeal the same way he measured distance on a trail, by touch and habit. He mixed batter and set a pan to brown, warmed a tin of beans, and slid both near a table scarred by years of use. The room smelled of warm grain, smoke, and something like fresh paint. Outside the pine boughs sang in the wind. Inside the small room formed itself around the hearth in the slow work of feeding 3 famished bodies. They ate with a discipline that held echoes of the house they had left. Lila set portions with even hands and offered first to Mira, who accepted with a solemn gratitude. Tobin asked about the cabin's corners and whether Elias had once lived in a town, a question that arrived precisely and politely. Their clothes were patched at elbows and knees, their boots bore the white rim of frozen slush. Yet their posture and speech suggested they belonged to a household where manners had been instilled. where good table manners formed a foundation for greater security. A photograph passed between them like a secret ledger. Lila kept it mostly hidden, fingers tight on its crease. Elias glimpsed faces, two people laughing beside iron rails, their clothes clean, their hats neat. The image suggested a life removed from hunger and cold, a city's hum rather than the slow hush of the mountains. He asked only once about the picture and Lila answered in a small, cautious voice. Their parents, she said, had gone away by train and did not return. There was a name, Warwick, that tasted like a ledger in her mouth, and a house in Denver that held more than warmth. As he stirred pots and tended coals, Elias found his own history coming forward like tide lines on a beach. He remembered nights when scarcity made choices brutal and clear, when he traded silence for a crust of bread and learned what it cost to claim mercy. Those memories did not pull him into sentiment, they edged him instead toward practical kindness. Providing shelter felt like balancing a small account. It required presence, steam and a consistent hearth rather than grand gestures. Conversation took modest shapes. Elias taught Tobin how to recognize fox and hare tracks, tracing the difference between wide paths and narrow, careful print. He showed Mira how to use a notch in a tall pine to find north by the angle of sun and shadow. Lila listened and then asked questions that went deeper than weather and wood, about towns, about the concept of law and whether a man haunted by the past could ever put it behind him. Her voice carried a composure older than her years. She spoke of Denver as if its name were a wound and of Warwick as a presence that required caution. The cabin slowly transformed from a shelter into something like a home through a series of small actions. Lila swept with measured strokes. Tobin fetched water without spilling, and Mira folded a blanket with a care that made Elias think of formalities he had forgotten. Each gesture accumulated into a grammar for belonging, bowls washed, fire banked, boots dried on the rug. Whereas his life had previously been a ledger of solitary tasks, the room began to host a shared economy of care. When they slept, they did so in a manner that made the night less empty. Mira lay curled and even, chest rising in small top. Tobin slept with fingers still stained by the cornmeal, face loose with uncomplicated dreams. Lila remained alert longer, thumb rubbing the photograph's faded edge while embers marked time in the hearth. Elias sat by the stove in the half-light and listened to the rhythm of breath and small movements, cataloging each sound with a suspicion that this peace might be temporary. Outside, the landscape smoothed every path into one quiet white sheet. Inside, a fragile warmth gathered like a cloth wrapped against the wind. Elias did not know then how much weight those children carried or how many eyes would soon search the rails for what belonged to them. For the moment his choice felt as simple as lighting a lamp, put warmth where there was cold, give food where there was hunger and see what happened next. He sat by the stove long after the children slept, letting the quiet press in like a slow tide. In that hour he counted how life might change. Small duties multiplied by another set of needs, laws and town gossip that would not respect mountain silence, and strangers whose hunger was other than cold. Even so, the simple calculus that guided him ultimately led him toward care. For reasons that surprised him, his hands were ready to do more than keep a roof. They were prepared to hold a family steadfastly. Weeks blended into a rhythm that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a small living household. Morning light warmed the stove, and Lila moved through her chores with an efficiency that suggested long practice. She swept, measured flour and stacked wood with even steady hands. Tobin carved small tools and toys from oak and pine, the shavings curling into soft spiraling shapes. His fingers grew steady. His face relaxed when a blade found a clean line. Mira learned constellations the way a child learns a lullaby, asking about bright points and inventing names for those she liked. At night she pressed her cheek to the glass and whispered questions to the sky. Elias answered with patient descriptions, shaping stories of rivers and distant towns. Elias found pleasure in teaching. He showed Tobin how to read the land. A broken twig pointed to recent passage, snow compaction betrayed hidden trails, and crushed cedar meant game had passed that way. He taught Lila secure knots and humane snares for rabbit. With Mira he practiced finding north by moss and by shadow, turning lessons into games so memory would keep them. Each new skill stitched the children to the place. Each success added a filament of confidence to their lives and a reason for Elias to wake in the dark to check the stove and traps. The cabin gained modest comforts. Lila hemmed a scrap of embroidered linen into a curtain that softened the window's bite. Tobin hollowed a small bowl for Mira's porridge and stamped a notch in its rim. Elias mended sleeves and taught practical patience. Each repair felt like a promise. Evenings carried conversation over clinking spoons and the soft tap of a carving knife. Laughter came in small bursts. A shared joke about the stove's temper or the cat from the woodpile filled the room with a domestic ease. Elias had not expected to feel. Trips to Pine Hollow became necessary and measured. Elias still trusted distance, so town visits were sparse. On one walk down with a pack of furs and the children at his heels, Lila watched shop windows with curiosity and caution. People glanced at the trio, then away. Pity and suspicion rode the same coat in a place where newcomers disturb balance. Amos, the storekeeper, greeted Elias with the blunt warmth of someone who kept his town in order. He measured coffee beans and counted change, then lowered his voice to pass a caution. A man had been asking about children seen near the general store. He wanted to know if anyone had offered shelter or taken them out of town. Amos's brow tightened when he said the name Victor Kane, and Elias felt the small hairs along his forearms stiffen as if wind had found a seam. Victor Kane was a different kind of question. Elias first noticed him at the town's edge. A silhouette too neat for Pine Hollow. Polished boots, coat cut close, hat brim precise. He watched with a stillness that belonged to someone practiced in observation rather than kindness. When Elias met Kane's eye, the man's nod did not reach his mouth. There was calculation in the way Kane's collar rose and in the quick, assessing movement of his shoulders. He asked measured questions of Amos about shipments and names. Questions that could be small talk but carried the weight of ledger work. Elias felt a creeping awareness that his mercies could draw attention of a kind he had avoided. Suspicion arrived in quieter ways as well. One night, while Lila tucked a blanket around Mira, a loose corner of fabric revealed the edge of paper tucked inside. Elias noticed the flash of ink and reached out without accusation. Lila surrendered the scrap, trusting the man who had offered corn and a bed. The paper was torn, with missing corners as if someone had tried to hide a lie. In neat script, visible words suggested corporate channels including the Colorado Railroad, Heirs, and a series of numbers that might be a claim. Elias read the fragment twice, feeling the room pivot. A legal term alone could alter the equation of their lives. It was a hinge that might swing toward fortune or peril, depending on who grasped its significance. The discovery altered the conversation around the stove. The conversation, which had been about the weather, turned to practical plans. How to keep the children safe when they visited town, whether to leave a marked trail for neighborly help or to obscure their path, and whether to seek counsel before strangers learned too much. Lila's composure shifted into strategy. Tobin's curiosity hardened into a guarded watchfulness. Mira's questions quieted as she sensed tension and leaned in for stories that distracted. Elias felt a fierce protectiveness that was both ingrained by habit and stirred by something new, a responsibility that extended beyond himself to another household's fragile claim. Amos's warning and the paper combined into a current beneath their days. Elias altered his routines in small ways. He took different routes while carrying water to avoid exposure from lower ridges. He stacked firewood to conceal his comings and goings. He taught Tobin how to bury a footprint by crossing it with another. At night he kept the shutters closed until dawn and showed Lila how to hide the photograph and paper between the floor planks, where a child's toes might not find them. Each adjustment felt like a quiet negotiation with danger. It required thought, discipline, and the stoic pleasure of a plan that protected those in his care. Even with vigilance, small joys persisted. Elias watched Lila coax a tiny fire to life with the patience he used as a young soldier to check his kit. He admired how Tobin whittled a toy horse that Mira named and carried like a talisman. Bedtime ritual became a comfort he guarded. A simple song Lila hummed while Elias read by lamp until their eyes closed. One evening, with the wind battering the roof, Elias stepped out to check on the dogs and paused because he felt he was being observed. From below the ridge, a shadow slipped between the pines and vanished. He stared until the shape dissolved into the night, chest tight with awareness resurfacing like a tide. The danger was no longer abstract. It moved in a shape that might return by daylight. The household stitched itself into a fragile balance of teaching and protection. Laughter threaded through caution. Elias found his hands full with unexpected work, preparing snares, patching clothes, and navigating the arithmetic of food and fuel. He also discovered a lighter weight of affection. The children gave him reasons to complete tasks, not just for survival but also for belonging. When he taught them a winter skill, he felt each lesson claim him more firmly to their future. The torn paper waited in a secret place beneath floorboards, a hinge between what had been and what might come. Outside, the wind pushed white clouds across the tree. Inside, by the stove, Elias laid a plan that began with keeping them safe and might, in time, lead toward proving the claim that rested in the faded ink. Ever found hope in a tough moment? Share your story below to inspire others. He kept watch through nights, resolved and quietly read. Elias waited until dawn, when the world had a thin, honest light that made tracks legible and breath visible. He set a kettle on the stove and watched as steam rose, considering how to ask questions that might disrupt the cabin's fragile order. Lila sat opposite, fingers folded around the photograph as if it were both a talisman and an instruction. He spoke with a low voice, careful as a step on thin ice, and asked about the faces, the train, and why the picture looked like a promise someone had tried to keep. Lila answered with a voice part steel and part smallness. Their parents were Jonathan and Clara Warwick, she said. They had been steady with money, dressed well, and traveled by rail for reasons she did not fully understand. One night, the train did not return. Lila told the story without the full contour of adult logic. Some facts she omitted because memory spared them, or because she had learned to protect shards of truth. Her fingers tightened on the photograph when she spoke of Denver and of an uncle, Lawrence, whose voice cut like suspicion. She described Lawrence with the precision of a man who kept accounts and the cruelty of someone who believed that law could be bent to personal will. He had watched the family, spoken blandly yet with menace, and when the parents died, he shifted from observer to guardian with a claim that felt like ownership. When the children resisted his control, they fled with little more than the photograph and a scrap of paper sewn into Lila's dress. Elias learned that the torn fragment named the Warwicks as beneficiaries of interests tied to Colorado Railroad holdings. The visible lines hinted at an estate large enough to attract men who valued wealth in terms of ledger. The phrase $6 million hovered unspoken. Lila pressed the paper to her chest and said it might be true. Elias felt an odd stir of warning braided with an embarrassed hope he had thought extinguished. These children were both vulnerable and valuable, a dangerous equation in a sparsely policed country. Outside, hoofprints marked the snow like deliberate punctuation. He saw deep wells where horses had trodden, and measured stride against stride until a pattern emerged. A small party had moved close enough to circle the area. The tracks did not meander. They suggested direction and intention. Someone had been close enough to notice the cabin's smoke and choose to skirt sightlines, which meant the threat was not random. Elias traced the prints with his eyes, feeling again the old muscle that read danger in small signs. Lila listened as Elias spoke of movement and safety with a focus beyond her years. She did not plead for permanence in the cabin. Instead, she asked where they would go and how quickly they could leave. She arranged the plan as if she were folding a map. Choose Eagle's Crest, a hunting shack behind a rock outcrop where wind hollowed a basin and sightlines narrowed. The route would follow ridges and gullies where scent and sound traveled poorly, allowing them to avoid the lower paths known to travelers and traders. He packed with a soldier's economy: blankets, warm garments, salted meat, a small pot, and tools to mend shoes and tear. He wrapped the torn paper in oiled cloth and slid it into a tin he could bury if needed. He included a lantern whose glass he wrapped to soften the glare and ropes to bind a stubborn door. Then in the half-light they moved like a practiced small troop, boots sinking into new snow and breathing mist behind them. Lila led, consulting a memory of routes and tree shapes that had been taught by necessity. Tobin moved with a guarded eagerness to serve, his small hands learning to carry wood without spilling. Mira trod with a trust that slowed Elias's heart. She looked back only once as if to ensure no pair of eyes had followed. The ridge compressed time into measured steps. Between rests they spoke little, conserving breath and energy. Each pause felt like a place where someone could have looked up and seen them, so they rested briefly and moved on. At one stop, Lila unfolded the photograph and spoke softly of Clara's laugh and of Jonathan's steady hands. The image carried an impossible world of parlors and carriages that belonged to a different geography of life. Elias listened, imagining rooms heated by coal and men who wore neat collars. The vision felt remote and absurd against the scrub and pine they now traversed. Yet the memory mattered. It gave the children a claim to one part of themselves that thieves might attempt to strip away. They reached Eagle's Crest by late afternoon when light had thinned to silver. The shack crouched behind a rock low and shuttered, its roof heavy with snow. Elias worked quickly to block sightlines, drew curtains tight, and set the kettle to boil. He arranged blankets into nests that trapped heat and taught Lila to bank coals, so the fire would last. The children moved through the space as if it already belonged to them, stacking bowls and stacking wood with a domestic speed that made the place feel less temporary. That night, Elias sat awake until the embers cooled and mapped out his worry in small sections. He pictured men who might come for the paper and those who would take a ledger's measure of the children as numbers rather than people. He pictured a lawful path as well, papers filed, a judge who listened, and the possibility of rightful protection without violence. The two visions jostled inside him like weather shifting on a ridge. He understood that the cabin had delayed confrontation. Eagle's Crest could hold them a while longer, but it could not be a permanent solution. At dawn, Elias made plans. He would send a cautious messenger to Amos, to inquire about a trustworthy lawyer. He would arrange for discreet counsel in Pine Hollow and prepare to prove the children's claim if needed. He kept the tin with the paper near his chest and slept in short bursts, listening for the soft creak of tack or the distant roll of hoof. When morning came, he rose with a resolve that surprised him. He would defend the children not only from cold but from men whose appetite for gain made them dangerous. He rehearsed town words that would not betray panic, ways to keep the children's story simple and true. He thought about the paper's missing seam and resolved to find counsel who could read fragments and make them whole. He planned for the worst, hoping a judge might listen and neighbors would stand witness. Outside, hoofprints marked the white like punctuation. Inside, Elias listened to the rhythm of small sleepers and felt a responsibility that had weight and purpose. He had moved them from a visible path into a narrower one, lined with rocks and wind, to conceal their steps. The decision altered the field on which danger might come. Elias felt the strange, fierce satisfaction of a man who had shifted from solitude to guardianship, knowing the fight ahead might take everything he owned steadily. A gray dawn slid over the ridge as Elias led the small party from Eagle's Crest, boots cutting fresh grooves into soft crust. The first day became a careful calculation: choose paths with sheltering pines, stay in gullies that muffled the wind, and measure pauses so that heat and motion balanced hunger and fatigue. Lila moved ahead with the surety of someone who had learned routes by memory. She picked lines that sheltered them and called back short directions. Tobin kept pace, though his breath came quickly and his cheeks reddened. He bore a carved bowl and adjusted the straps without complaint. Mira walked close to Elias until mid-afternoon when the cold slowed her steps, and Elias lifted her, feeling the child's weight sit like a promise against his neck. He carried her with caution, watching for crusted snow that might give and for thin ice hiding water. They camped the first night beneath battered firs where wind eased and the sky opened to stars. Elias taught shelter rituals: bank a fire to keep embers, pile branches to break gusts, and insulate sleeping places with boughs and blankets. He showed Tobin how to arrange rocks to hold a pot steady and taught Lila to read the sky. Low, flat clouds might bring sleet. Crisp clarity meant steady cold. Mira asked about stars and listened attentively, much like a student. Elias turned lessons into games so that useful information would stay with them. The second day steepened, and the world narrowed to a white corridor between trunks and rocks. Snow pressed against boots, and thin air tugged at lungs. Lila moved with economy, setting stick markers notched for return. Elias carried more food, rope and a tin with the damaged paper wrapped in oiled cloth. He watched Lila and saw ownership in how she shielded the photograph in the locket at her throat. Tobin lagged in open stretches, and Elias adjusted pace into short goals so fatigue could be met. At midday, Lila opened a small locket, its metal dulled by handling, and inside 2 portraits sat behind glass, Jonathan with a steady chin and Clara with a luminous smile. She set the locket in Elias's hand with a trust that expected care. She said their parents had funded schools and written about helping children learn to read. The revelation refined the climb's meaning. Inheritance hinted not only at money but also at purpose. Someone had believed that education mattered, even when winter shut children away. They broke through a final ridge into a basin where Eagle's Crest crouched like a waiting hand. The shack's roof slumped low and stones marked an old fire pit. Elias approached from leeward so smoke would not betray them. Tobin scouted and returned with news. No fresh hoofprints were near the structure, although older tracks showed that a hunter had passed by days earlier. Elias felt a sense of relief like warmth under a hat. He swept floorboards, banked the stove and tested the lantern. The children worked with domestic speed, stacking bowls, sweeping corners and arranging blankets to trap heat. That evening, Elias taught reading of weather beyond shapes, how bark splitting suggested temperature swings, and how animal behavior signaled danger. He spoke of ravens gathering before the thaw and of the sudden silence of birds before a predator passed. He turned lessons into stories of travelers who listened and were spared, and of those who ignored signs and paid the price. Lila absorbed details with discipline, Tobin asked technical questions about knots, and Mira held each fact as a possible tool against the cold. The Lockett story mingled with mending and cooking talk, how money had funded reading rooms, how Clara had laughed over books until inked pages made her smile. Elias imagined roomy schoolhouses with blackboards and children gathered by windows. The idea became resolved. If the paper proved true, the money could be used to build schools to keep other children safe from routes like the one his wards had taken. They kept watch in shifts, Elias and Lila trading hours by the stove, while Tobin and Mira leaned into exhaustion. The night wind spoke like a distant city and the flames whispered back. When Elias checked the traps, he saw a faint track at the basin's lip leading away toward the lower woods, not toward the shack. Relief entwined with a warning. Watchers had been present but had changed course. Deliberate watchers could follow up with reinforcements or wait until the shelter failed. He closed the door against the cold and felt a tightening of his resolve. Warmth required vigilance to be maintained. They wasted no time. Each movement tightened into choreography. Check traps at first light, test runnels for ice, and keep smoke low so it would not betray them. Elias taught folding methods that trapped warmth and layering techniques to create pockets of still air, preserving heat through long nights. He demonstrated how to melt snow without wasting wood, place clean ice on a low flame, catch the first drip and feed it back until a pot is brimming with broth. Tobin learned to cup hands and to layer socks so toes would not freeze. Mira hummed to keep spirits from collapse. They practiced quiet signals, a single whistle for slow retreat, a double note for immediate cover, and discrete marks on trees only they could read. 2 cuts at hip height for safe passage, 1 notch for warning. Meals doubled as lessons. Thin slices of salted meat were stretched into broth. Cornmeal porridge was thickened to resist the cold, yet left extra for the morning, and small caches were hidden beneath stones for emergency. Small comforts reappeared, a shared cup of tea at dusk, the surprise of a dried berry and the ceremony of lighting a lantern to mark the end of labor. Lila kept a ragged notebook and tracked supplies with care. Tobin carved toys and left them near the hearth as tokens of laughter. Mira drew maps in soot, marking caches and safe turns. These tasks were survival and the slow reclamation of childhood. Each stitch of work rewove a life they had lost. On the second dawn, Elias sat with the locket and photograph spread across his knees, feeling the responsibility weigh as heavily as a pack. He thought of classrooms where light pooled on desks, and of teachers who believed every child could learn. The idea hardened into resolve. If the paper proved true, the funds could become reading rooms and schools that built up other children rather than reducing them to routes of escape. He slept with a steady mind, committed to keeping them safe long enough to find counsel and to turn a claim into shelter for learning and care. Before leaving the next morning, Elias took inventory of a different kind. Not just food and rope but also witnesses and proof. He planned a cautious trip to Pine Hollow to speak with Amos and to seek a sympathetic ear among the townfolk. He practiced what to say so panic would not show and rehearsed how to keep the paper's story simple and true. He considered friends from a past life who might be persuaded to stand as witnesses and thought of writing a simple note to a lawyer who kept fair accounts. The work ahead required patience and discretion, not only Elias rose with a resolve sharpened by the children's trust and the Lockett's quiet plea for care, steadfastly ready. Snow pressed lightly against the shuttered windows when the knock came at Eagle's Crest. Elias stood with a rifle leaning against his hip. He moved to the door and peered through the slit. 2 figures leaned into the light beyond, one neat, the other ragged. The neat man wore a coat cut close at the waist, and a felt hat. His posture fit a ledger rather than labor. The second man wore heavy boots and had a beard that suggested he had traveled extensively. The neat one stepped forward and introduced himself with a formal voice. Victor Kane, he said, representing parties with legal interest in the Warwick estate and claiming the children under that interest. The words landed heavily. Elias glanced at Lila. She stood composed, hand resting on the locket at her throat. Tobin gripped a chair. Mira watched with wide eyes. Elias opened the door a finger's width, keeping the rifle angled but ready. Kane's gaze slid over faces and then fixed on Elias as if testing lines on a page. He produced a folded document, crisp and stamped, and spoke of trustees, obligations, guardianship clauses, and reward for cooperation. His language was neat and edged. Elias weighed options: explain and risk exposure, or refuse and force confrontation. He knew enough of law to respect danger in Kane's script while mistrusting the man who read it. I shelter these children, Elias said. Steady. They sleep under my roof. Kane's practiced smile thinned. He mentioned Lawrence Warwick and the fortune tied to railroad interests, suggesting that returning the children to Denver would be cleaner and more proper, allowing courts to resolve the claims. The neat man's civility framed appetite. The ragged companion shifted boots and let a glance move toward the stove where a pot warmed. Lila spoke quietly and with steady courage. They are with Elias. Mr. Thornton keeps us safe. Kane's lightness faded. He pressed the idea of legal recourse and offered an escort to town to process formal claims, his words smooth like negotiation. Elias refused to hand over custody. He thought of the torn paper hidden beneath planks, the locket, and the risk that Lawrence's name carried. Greed could sharpen men into violence. Law might become pressure, and pressure might become force. The ragged man spat and said in a low voice, "They could be persuasive." Elias tightened his hold on the rifle but kept the aim low. The room smelled of beans and pine smoke. That ordinary scent became a boundary he refused to yield. Kane folded his paper and measured Elias as if assessing a fence. He named a reward again, syllables practiced like a litany. He suggested contacts who handled claims discreetly, people who could make a handover simple. Elias translated the offer into peril, ledgers that purchased silence, muscle, and complicity. Lila's small cold hand found Elias's sleeve beneath the table, and the touch steadied him. "Please," she whispered, "we stay." Her plea demanded protection rather than riches. Elias chose to protect. "I'm their guardian," he said, the phrase like a bolt. "I will defend them." Kane's patience thinned. He nodded to his companion and the rough man stepped forward, his boots scuffing the threshold like an assertion. The neat one's civility hardened. He proposed cooperation once more, confident his document would carry weight. Elias answered calmly, "No escort, no claim in my home." The men measured which option served their ledger best, and then turned away, walking toward the ridge with deliberate steps, boots leaving patterned wells in the snow. Elias latched the door with a practiced hand and moved the rifle to a corner, replacing posture with plan. He inventoried their needs quietly: food to last without a trip to town, extra oil for the lamp, and a cautious note to Amos at dawn. The threat shifted from a rhetorical claim to an active hazard. Solitude was traded for guardianship, accompanied by vulnerability. That night, under shuttered windows, Elias wrote actions in a line of ink: secure counsel discreetly in Pine Hollow, hide the torn paper beneath floorboards where casual eyes would not find it, prepare false trails to confuse trackers, practice children's whistles until sound carried meaning without speech. He taught Tobin misdirection and showed Lila how to tuck the locket into a hollow log. Mira slept against his knee, unaware of measures taken to keep her safe. Elias checked the rifle's action as if blessing a tool and thought of Lawrence Warwick's name like a slow bell of danger. He promised a legal fight if needed, though he knew justice required coin counsel and courage in uneven measures. For now he would be protector, planner, and if necessary defender. Elias noted options: call Amos at dawn, send a quiet messenger, ready a false trail, and seek counsel while keeping the children hidden. He planned contingency measures. Elias rode to Pine Hollow at first light, and sought Amos with a quiet purpose that left no rumor in the street. Pine Hollow offered a single lane of shops and a small office, where formality and gossip crossed paths. Amos handed over a folded newspaper and tapped a small item that named Lawrence Warwick as a person of interest in an earlier train mishap. The wording suggested inquiry, and noted discrepancies around how the wreck had been reported. Elias read the brief lines twice, and felt a cold clarity. Suspicion had entered the record, and with it a new dimension of danger. Lila walked beside Elias on a bench under the post and spoke of the memory she had held like a splinter. She said that months before, she had hidden behind curtains in a parlor and overheard Lawrence argue with their parents over claims and accounts. At one heated point he had slammed a ledger until pages scattered. She remembered the smell of brandy and the rasp of a voice that measured worth like a sum. A carriage bell had sounded late that night, and later a train that was supposed to carry Jonathan and Clara never returned. Lila had been small and frightened then. Now her recollection formed a narrative of motive. Elias took the paper and the girl's words to Judge Eleanor Holt. He had earlier drafted provisional adoption affidavits, with 2 Pine Hollow witnesses in case he needed legal standing. Now those papers mattered. Judge Holt read the torn fragment and Elias's notes, setting a steady course to record the affidavits provisionally, open an inquiry into the Warwick estate, and request a review of railway and insurance documents. She did not promise immediate justice, but she marshaled a process that could protect the children if corroboration followed. Back at the shack, Lila supplied details she had not told in town. She described a ledger page torn clean and entries that tied payments to a line labeled with words like settlement. She remembered a study where Lawrence kept papers and the pause of a man who counted coins with his fingers lingering. Elias asked careful questions, and wrote down answers that could stand in court as clear statements rather than frightened fragments. The response in Pine Hollow was small and steady. Amos agreed to witness the affidavit. A farmer who once worked along the line remembered seeing a carriage near the tracks the night of the accident, and agreed to provide a note. A reporter's clipped inquiries had already nudged the county coroner to glance again at the file. These confirmations were modest but meaningful. Memory, paper, and a few names together could assemble a case that courts could examine. Elias balanced legal work with day-to-day protection. He taught Lila how to shape testimony into plain sentences free of embellishment, practiced calm answers with Tobin, so he would not be led into panic, and coached Mira on simple replies to strangers. He hid the torn paper beneath the floorboards, and placed a tin with copies of witness notes in a hollow rock cache. He altered routes to town, cleared a false trail, and taught the children to read subtle signals he left on trees to mark danger or safety. The practical tasks were small but necessary. They built breathing room for the slower machinery of justice. He sought counsel in Pine Hollow and found an attorney willing to review the torn fragment and prepare emergency motion. The lawyer explained that legal hooks, affidavits, witness statements, and a coroner's interest would make violent appropriation harder and more traceable. Paperwork was not armor, but it created a traceable path that could turn men toward courtrooms rather than raw force. Elias felt a brittle relief. The work was slow, but it moved in ordered steps. As inquiries expanded, Elias organized the testimony and evidence methodically. He wrote a clear timeline based on Lila's recollections and checked her dates against train manifests that Amos helped locate. He gathered neighbor notes and pressed the farmer for specifics about the carriage's direction and time. He rehearsed questions with Lila until her voice sounded steady, then recorded her answers in his hand and placed copies with the attorney. Each small confirmation added weight to the inquiry and made the path to the formal process firmer. The county coroner sent a rider requesting sworn statements and a preliminary review of the wreck file. Elias viewed the message as a necessary gear clicking into place. The coroner's interest meant investigators would follow paper leads rather than rely on rumors. It meant conducting interviews, having archivists check ledgers, and the possibility that a missing page of accounting could reappear in testimony. Elias did not celebrate. He improved caches, rehearsed misdirections with Tobin, and taught Lila to remove the locket and hide it among tools if danger pressed. Neighbors offered small proofs. Amos signed an affidavit. The farmer provided a dated note. A clerk in the rail office confirmed a late-night ledger entry that had since been noted as missing. These parts assembled like planks into a bridge. Not definitive proof, but enough to move investigators. Elias felt the steady work of truth taking shape. Each testimony a slow stitch. Emotion joined procedure. Elias often thought of Jonathan and Clara as people who had mattered, and of the locket that held their faces. He read Lila's statements aloud beside the stove until the sentences felt solid and not fragile. He thought of courts where ledgers and witnesses would meet and of the scale where motive might be weighed. He worried that Lawrence might react when pressure mounted. He prepared contingencies, false trails, hidden caches, and a plan to summon legal escort if threats escalate. The town's response was modest but crucial. The process had begun, and official pages would carry suspicion into inquiry. Elias had shifted from sheltering to stewardship. He had become an advocate who recorded details and rallied witnesses. He asked Lila to promise she would tell the truth plainly when called to testify. She agreed, and the agreement steadied them both. Elias's nights grew occupied with writing and organizing. He penciled timelines, labeled witness notes and couriered copies to the attorney in town. He practiced Lila's brief testimony until her sentences came free of fear, and he taught Tobin precise signals to warn of riders. He met quietly with two neighbors who affirmed seeing unfamiliar lights near the line and who agreed to speak if subpoenaed. The coroner's office asked for a list of witnesses and a summary of possible evidence. A rider returned with the request. Elias felt the grind of legal work settle into a disciplined approach rather than panic. He read the torn paper until the ink blurred and the weight of duty set. The past had been uncovered and now the future required proof, patience and courage. He watched the children's breath rise and fall, and his resolve hardened into a steady, deliberate action. Gather facts, protect the young, and let law carry the weight of judgment. Ever fought for what's right against all odds? Share your experience below. That night, Elias sat by the stove and watched the children sleep, resolved that proof and patience would be their path to justice. Snow fell fine and steady over Pine Hollow. The morning Elias arranged a meeting at Amos's store, and the town seemed to hold its breath as people gathered to see what law and testimony might yield. Amos cleared benches. Arrivals filled the store. Elias stood near the door with Lila at his side and the locket and photograph secure at her throat. Victor Kane arrived with the confidence of a man who believed in documents and the sway of polite argument. Lawrence Warwick arrived, well-dressed but impatient. Judge Eleanor Holt sat with a small clerk and opened the meeting with a tone that called for plain speech and calm, directing that facts be stated and witnesses heard. Elias's attorney set copies on the counter. People watched. The room's warm breath met the winter air that pressed at the window. Lila stepped forward and unfolded the trust document Elias had kept. The paper listed names, dates and clauses that linked Jonathan and Clara Warwick to holdings in the Colorado Railroad, as well as named heirs and trustee responsibility. Lila read portions aloud with steady clarity: the clause that named the children beneficiaries, the language that assigned trustee duties, and the line that defined rightful process for custody. The figure of $6 million fell silent in the room. Then she told what she had hidden. How Lawrence had argued with their parents about the speed of settlement and how, as a child, she had watched a ledger slammed down in anger. She described a torn page and entries that suggested payments tagged as an accident settlement. Her words were plain, precise, and free of melodrama. They carried the force of memory translated into fact. Lawrence's first impulse was denial. He suggested a clerical error and misinterpretation, implying that newspaper gossip had twisted the lines into a motive. Kane cited trusteeship and procedure. The contest between ledger and witness tightened into a careful exchange, document versus doubt, memory against polite legalism. Elias presented corroborating evidence: a farmer's note that placed Lawrence's carriage near the line at an unusual hour, Amos's recollection of late ledgers and unscheduled transactions, and a clerk's notation of a missing page. These confirmations fit together. The torn paper matched town records. Judge Holt questioned the witnesses closely. Neighbors provided dates and details. A farmer reported seeing a carriage at an odd hour. The clerk confirmed a missing ledger entry that matched Lila's description. Lawrence attempted to shift blame and call witnesses to attest to his propriety, but under questioning he contradicted himself on minor facts. Kane's calm faltered as witnesses and records assembled against the crafted language. When denials matched statements and ledger notes, Lawrence's defenses thinned into small bitter retorts and evasions. Judge Holt summarized the case as involving a torn document, witnesses, the coroner's interest, and missing ledger entry. She said plainly that given the corroboration and the potential for harm, she would not leave the matter to rumor. She ordered Lawrence taken into custody pending a formal inquiry. Deputies were called and later the necessary forms were filed. The town watched as law, not revenge, took the lead. Relief moved through the store. Neighbors offered comfort. Amos set bowls of stew and hot tea before Lila and Elias, like acts of community support. Kane lingered, his poise shaken by the assembled witness and record. The judge instructed investigators to preserve evidence and to avoid vigilantism, while encouraging a formal process. That evening, Elias walked back toward the shack with the children, feeling a sense that the immediate threat had been shifted into public channel. He felt neither triumph nor complete safety. The legal machinery would take time and require further corroboration, yet neighbors whom he had seldom seen near his cabin came forward with offers: wood stacked beside a path, rations left at the door, an elder bringing a blanket for Mira. The locket glinted in low light at Lila's throat, and Elias thought of Jonathan and Clara as people who had left traces of care that might yet be honored. In the days that followed, the town tightened its steps around inquiry, council drafted motions, affidavits were sworn, and ledgers were copied. Judge Holt signed interim protective orders, preserved evidence, and paused any transfer of Warwick's assets pending inquiry. Elias coordinated witnesses, filed documents and practiced clear testimony about dates and ledger notes. The coroner requested original ledger pages. The rail office produced files that showed gaps and missing entries. The coroner's interest prompted formal queries, and investigators began to follow paper leads. Neighbors offered comfort and practical help. Wood was delivered, extra rations were provided, and a teacher volunteered to tutor the children. That possibility steadied Lila, and she began to imagine classrooms filled with other children and books. Elias felt responsibility lighten as hope nested beside duty. Investigators visited the rail office, the coroner requested records, and hearings were scheduled. Deputies led Lawrence past Amos's window to the county lockup. The sight offered sober satisfaction, justice as papers and witness, not spectacle. Kane left the town that day with a carriage that turned a different course. Lila and Elias met with Judge Holt to confirm protections and learn what evidence the courts needed. The judge commended the town for its measured action and urged patience. Elias spent nights organizing witness notes, penciling timelines from Lila's memory, and preparing to present testimony that would hold under scrutiny. The coroner sought sworn statements. A clerk in the rail office supplied partial files, which revealed gaps in the record. Those lacunae pointed investigators toward lines of inquiry about access and motive. The town's slow-moving processes clattered, subpoenas were issued, affidavits filed, and interviews were scheduled. Neighbors provided small proofs. Amos signed an affidavit, a farmer handed a dated note, and a clerk produced a copied entry. Each piece built a lattice around truth. Elias trained Lila to answer clearly. Tobin learned to give precise details without panic. Mira practiced small routines that kept her steady. The town offered practical solidarity, woodpiles, extra food, and a teacher ready to work when the hearings quieted. Each act transformed private peril into a public issue with avenues for resolution. Elias set a list of steps: issuing subpoenas for witnesses, retrieving documents, coordinating with council, and implementing measures to ensure the children slept without fear. The town's slow gears moved toward accountability. Elias felt comfort. The legal path remained long, but the process had begun and public remedies were possible. What does standing up for justice mean to you? Let us know below. Elias stood in the Denver courthouse with a steady heart and hands that had learned to perform small, necessary tasks rather than grand gestures. The winter light angled through tall panes and cut clean lines across benches where witnesses sat. Elias listened as the prosecution presented ledger entries, witness statements, and the coroner's findings that together painted a pattern of motive and concealment. In the gallery, neighbors from Pine Hollow watched with careful faces, Amos among them, and the attorney who had taken the case pointed to the ledger gaps, dated notes, and testimony that matched a torn page of accounting. Judge Holt presided with a quiet gravity that made language precise and left no room for flourish. Jurors weighed evidence that had been gathered slowly and honestly, a small machinery of corroboration built from memory, documents, and steady witness. When the verdict came, it felt less like thunder and more like the falling of snow, inevitable, clean, and finally settling guilty on counts that proved intent to defraud and to conceal. Lawrence Warwick went from being a man with polished coats to a figure whose every advantage had been undone by paper and neighbor testimony. Deputies led him away under formal orders, and townfolk watched as a version of justice moved through civic channels rather than private hands. After conviction, Elias moved to finalize what he had started in hushed, practical steps. His provisional adoption papers were presented to the court, witnesses attested to his guardianship, and a clerk stamped forms that made his claim official. The documents that had once served as makeshift protections now held legal force. The ink of signatures and the weight of proper filing transformed the cabin's temporary shelter into a legitimate home. Returning to Eagle's Crest felt different with those papers in his pack. The path through the pines led not to concealment but to a household that could stand in public and in law. The cabin itself changed slowly. Elias kept the same stove and the same rough table but added a small order: a shelf for ledger books, a tin for addressed letters, and a tidy place where the locket and the new family portrait could rest without fear of being lost. Lila took to keeping ledgers neat and to arranging papers with the care of someone who had seen how records could save or endanger lives. Tobin practiced carpentry in a way that made the cabin sturdier, installing a better latch and repairing a sagging step, taking delight in the practical progress. Mira, small and steady, planted a winter greens box near the door and learned how to coax sprouts from mud. The Warwick funds that reached them were handled with counsel and oversight rather than secrecy. Lawyer Mills, a pragmatic man who preferred audits and transparent ledgers, helped establish a trust with trustees from Pine Hollow and the neighboring valley. The first allocations prioritized repair and schooling. The small schoolhouse received new panes and benches, the clinic received supplies for winter ailments, and a modest stipend ensured children in outlying cabins would receive warm clothing and books. Elias learned to sit at meetings and to speak plainly, how many coats were allocated, which books would be purchased, and how to ensure supplies reached those who needed them most. He found an odd satisfaction in the mundanity of oversight, reading budget lines, answering questions about distribution, and signing receipts, tasks that protected results and removed temptation from private hands. The community responded in ways that felt purposeful rather than performative. Amos organized donated volumes and kept a ledger of borrowers, a retired teacher arranged reading hours by the stove in the school, and neighbors set aside days to mend garments for winter distribution. The local clerk copied files so that evidence could be stored in multiple locations, and the county's records demonstrated transparency that prevented single-person control. In the mornings, Elias taught the children maps and the arithmetic of provision. In the evenings they chopped wood and baked cornbread, ordinary acts that stitched their days into steadier scenes. The family portrait that replaced the torn photograph was simple. Elias with a hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, Tobin grinning with a carved toy in hand, and Mira holding a small bouquet of dried flowers. It hung above the stove and seemed to warm the room with a different light than flame, a light born of belonging rather than solitude. There were more challenging moments, technical disputes over trust language, opponents seeking to contest minor clauses, and the strain of public attention that sometimes felt intrusive. Elias met these with paper and patient counsel, where once he had trusted only his own skills, he now relied on process and on community safeguards that distributed power. He learned to answer auditors and to attend meetings with engineers who planned the school's insulation and the clinic's heating. He found that his duty had expanded to include asking the right questions and ensuring accountability. Through all of that, the children grew into roles both and meaningful. Lila managed correspondence and helped choose which villages received books. Tobin apprenticed with the carpenter in Pine Hollow for a season and learned to measure beams and read plans. Mira helped at the school and loved to sit beside small children while a volunteer read aloud. The trust funds were never squandered on grandiosity. Council and town representatives ensured transparency, ensuring the money served children rather than vanity. Lawyer Mills and town trustees oversaw the distribution and reported back at public meetings, where Amos took minutes and the teacher presented usage statistics. In quiet hours, Elias returned to small domestic acts, mending mittens, teaching Mira how to braid yarn into warm caps, and listening to Tobin describe how he had reinforced the roof. He kept the locket hidden in a drawer and sometimes took it out to look at the tiny faces, feeling that the past had shifted into a compass rather than a wound. The legal victory did not erase grief or the scars of what had occurred. Still, it redirected legacy toward public good, reading rooms, repaired clinic stoves and a fund ensuring winter clothing for children across the valley. Pine Hollow's celebrations were modest, a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the school, accompanied by a pot of porridge shared among community members, small speeches about duty and kindness, and a quiet moment when the children lined up to receive donated books. Elias spoke briefly and honestly, mentioning duty and gratitude, and Lila read a passage that made some of the older faces nod with a recognition of past losses transformed into present care. In the evening, quiet Elias sometimes thought of subscribers and listeners who had followed the cabin's story and felt gratitude that a tale of hardship had led to action. He felt a gentle obligation to ask others to stay connected to stories that could change lives. They celebrated small gains with modest feasts, pledged stewardship, and promised to teach many children to read daily.